Hi, this is Cheryl Johnson, and this is Assessments and Evaluations for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Children, Part 2, and we're now going to be addressing Module 2, which focuses on evaluation and assessment terminology. There are 7 modules in this whole series, but this module is going to be a little bit longer, so bear with me. There's a lot of terminology that we want to address as we move through this. First of all, evaluation. An evaluation is defined in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the law that guides the work that we do. Laws are passed by Congress, and then regulations are developed by the appropriate agency. So if it's an education law, general education would go to the Department of Ed. If it's special education, it goes to the Office of Special Education Programs that is in the Department of Ed. And in that whole process, there's proposed regulations that are published, and those proposed regulations go out for review that allow parents, professionals, advocacy groups to have input on the final definitions. So it's a nice process that does allow additional input. So these definitions that we're talking about, again, are from the regulations, and they're from the Part B section of the regulations, which deal with children ages 3 to 21. So evaluation are the procedures that determine the disability as well as the special education and related services that the child needs. The initial evaluation, which would occur when you transition from the early intervention system in your individual family service plan, occurs within 60 days of parents signing consent. Sometimes that evaluation may complement an evaluation that came from the Part C system. Other times, a whole new evaluation will be administered. Regardless, we want to make sure that all evaluations are conducted by qualified personnel, and we want to make sure that they are sufficiently comprehensive to identify all the special education needs that our children have, whether or not they're commonly linked to the disability category that they're in. The initial evaluation has to include a variety of assessment tools and strategies. So that starts with functional, developmental, and academic information that includes information about how the children are doing in their classroom, as well as standardized assessment and information from the parents that could come in the form of checklists or surveys. Or there could be some actual assessments that the parents would provide information about. The results then determine eligibility and the content of the IEP in order to enable children to participate in their general education program. No single measure can be used as a sole criterion, so it has to be multidisciplinary. The assessment instruments must be technically sound and accurately reflect the child's aptitude or performance level rather than reflecting their impaired sensory, manual, or speaking skills. So for instance, for a child who is deaf or hard of hearing, we don't want the assessment to, or all aspects of the assessment, to necessarily impact the implications of that hearing loss. Sometimes we want to get to the aptitude that they have, irregardless of what challenges present from having those other issues. So the tests that are given have to be administered in the child's native language or communication mode. Exceptions might be if you're specifically testing the speech of a child, then obviously you want to be able to see how they pronounce certain words to look for problems that will need to be worked on, even though perhaps a child's native language is American Sign Language. Furthermore, some children use more than one language, so we may need to deliver tests in American Sign Language as well as tests in listening and spoken language. So the multidisciplinary evaluation, as I said, includes functional, developmental, and academic information, so that's information about the child. In addition, we need to know information about the learning environment that the child is in. So our professionals have to go in and assess the classroom management, classroom acoustics, and visual access to determine whether or not that classroom environment is going to be supportive of that child's learning. It also includes parent and family perspectives, a review of any records or medical records or any other relevant sources that might exist. And for children who are transitioning out of high school into post-secondary education or work employment settings, there are special assessment instruments that occur as part of that transition process. So in the multidisciplinary evaluation, again, there's a number of areas that are considered. Reading and writing are core academic areas and skills that our children need to have in English. Language and communication may be in English or American Sign Language or some other language if they're Spanish or a different language as their primary language. We will also want to know how they access communication. We want to look at other academic content such as science, social studies, other academic programs that the children are involved in, because the reading and writing skills that they have will have an influence on their performance in those areas. Other includes psychological assessments, health assessments, physical abilities, and adaptive behavior. They may not all be given for every child, but if there's any concern at all, it's helpful in this multidisciplinary process to have a nice full picture of the whole child. I believe that we should look at the social emotional performance status of every child, so I've left that one separately, and there are tools that we have available to us to do that. Lastly, we have special content. These are areas that are unique to a child who is deaf and hard of hearing. That content includes audiology. We want children to know how to talk about their audiogram, what their hearing loss means. We want them to know what their rights are as an individual who's deaf or hard of hearing and be able to explain that to others. The audiology piece also includes their hearing aids or their personal technology that they're using. The career education deals with what our plans are for students or their plans as they move out of the education system, how they explore different options, and how they talk about the accommodations that might be needed as a result of their hearing or communication problems. Deaf culture, I think, is important for every child, whether they consider themselves part of the deaf culture or not. I think it's important that they learn and understand what deaf culture is, prominent persons among the deaf culture, and be able to decide for themselves kind of where they fit. And I think this is a real important step to help with self-identity. And even our children who are not deaf, if they're hard of hearing and don't consider themselves deaf, they really need to understand deaf culture, because indeed that may change. Their viewpoint might change once they understand what deaf culture is. Listening and speaking is probably tied more to language and communication, but for children who choose that mode of communication, we need specific assessment and programming to develop listening and speaking skills. Lastly, self-determination and advocacy is important for all children, but we want our children to be able to develop personal responsibility for their actions, for what they need, and be able to advocate for those appropriately. Another part of evaluation, we've talked about the initial evaluation. Sometimes parents don't agree with the school's evaluation, and they have a right to an independent educational evaluation. There's only one IEE that's allowed per evaluation period, which is usually every 3 years, but that could change depending on the agreement with the school. The school has to provide information to the parents when an IEE is requested, and the school does not have to, or the parents don't have to tell the school why they're asking for that IEE. It must be conducted by a qualified examiner that's not employed by the school, however. And it must be provided at no cost to parents. So the only caveat there would be if the school has completed a due process hearing that ruled the school's evaluation is appropriate, then the school would not have to go on and provide an independent educational evaluation. But I believe this is something that parents need to certainly be aware of. And every now and then it's important for parents to take advantage of this, particularly if they're not comfortable with the evaluation results that the school has provided. Lastly, if parents obtain an IEE independently, the school has to consider the results only if it meets the school criteria with respect to qualified provider and other aspects of assessment. They don't have to abide by that independent evaluation unless they help the parents arrange it. So again, if it's independently done by the parent, the school is only obligated to consider the results of that evaluation. So it's important to go through the school when you request an IEE. The next type of evaluation is reevaluation. So anytime the school feels like the performance or education or the related services of that child warrant, they can request a reevaluation. If the parents or the teacher requests a reevaluation, it can be done. It cannot generally occur more than once a year unless the parent or school agrees that it needs to be done more frequently or that there has been some incident that has changed how that child's performing that would lead to the need to do another evaluation. The reevaluation should occur every 3 years unless the parents in the school agree that there's no new information that's going to come from a reevaluation and it's not necessary. I don't think this happens very frequently because I think parents and schools feel like a reevaluation every 3 years is reasonable. And then again, it must conform to all of the evaluation requirements that are laid out in IDE about appropriate assessments, appropriate person doing the assessment and able to interpret, and so forth. Okay, we're going to switch gears now and talk about some specific terminology that relates to assessment. First is the bell curve, and the bell curve is just an illustration of normal distribution. So if your child's classroom is giving a test and your child's classroom has a mix of all typical peers and kids with disabilities, you're going to see that the results of that test fall out on this bell curve. Some children are going to do better than the average performance, and some will do more poorly. The median is the middle score. So if your tests are, so they're on a scale of 0 to 100, the median would be 50. So that's the middle score based on the distribution that you would have. We also look at standard deviations. So on this slide, you'll see that there's a +1, +2, +3, +4, and then minus numbers representing how far away from the mean, the average, a child is performing. Generally, +2 to -2 are considered within the normal range. If we're more than 2 standard deviations above the mean or below the mean, then they would indicate exceptional skills. Another aspect of this is percentile. And often on tests, you'll see that child scoring at the 84th percentile. That means that 84% of children are scoring at that point or below. And then roughly 16% would be scoring better. So the percentile rank is a really easy way to put these results into the perspective of how all of the children are performing. And the percentile rank and cumulative percentage are all equal. Some other terminology. The mean is the average of the scores. So you may have several tests that your child gives as a subset of a particular test, and you may average all of the scores in that group of tests in order to come up with a mean or average performance for that. IQ testing is one example of how that happens because there's many subtests that are then averaged to give you a mean for each of the areas that are assessed. The raw score is the number of items that are scored correct on any test. The child gets 50 items and they get 15 correct. 15 would be the raw score. The standard score is a statistical procedure that changes the raw score to a standard score that allows for the child to be compared with other students and with performance on other tests. The scaled score is also oftentimes reported, and that's a score that's adjusted that reflects the performance of a sample group. So you may have a whole class taking a test, but then you have a sample group of how deaf and hard of hearing children do on that particular assessment. And if we adjust that score, then we have a scaled score because it's just addressing that particular sample group. The composite score would be the average score from combining all of the subtest scores. And then the confidence interval is a reliability measure that conveys how precise this measurement is. A 90% confidence interval means that 90% of the time, persons with this score will fall into this confidence interval range. I want to say just one more thing about composite scores. Composite scores that combine individual subtest scores may overlook individual deficiencies that a child has in a particular area. So while you can do composite scores, I think it's important to look at performance on each one of the subtests of the individual tests that are given so that you have a better understanding of how that child's doing, where their strengths are, and where their needs are. Just a few more terms. Grade equivalent would be the grade that corresponds to a particular test score. So if your child has a standard score of 50, the grade equivalent probably is the grade that they're in, which would be whatever that is. If their chronological age is 3.5, grade equivalent on that test is 3.5, then they're performing at their chronological age. Chronological level. Age equivalent is different because it estimates the age level, not the grade level. So if a child is 8 years, 5 months old, and the test illustrates they're performing at 9 years, they're performing above their chronological age. So there's grade equivalents and age equivalents that are used in various tests. Tests can be norm referenced or criterion referenced. Norm reference tests are based on standardization of a whole group. So like your bell curve, you have a range of abilities so that you get that normal bell curve. Whereas criterion reference tests compare scores to a particular performance standard. Many times in testing, we want kids to perform 90 to 100% to get an A, maybe 80 to 89% to get a B. That would be a criterion reference test because we're looking at a certain mastery level rather than the bell curve. The last type of test is a curriculum-based measurement. These are often a bit more informal tests that are used for monitoring progress, that are taken at intervals that could be daily, weekly, monthly, to look at what kind of progress a child's making towards meeting the goal that's been set out. These are very critical to plan for instruction so that we can immediately make changes in instruction if a child's not making the progress that we anticipate. Here's a sample of a test on an elementary age student. This is the receptive one-word picture vocabulary test. And in a report, you may see language that sounds like this. This test is a norm reference test which provides an assessment of receptive vocabulary. The test measured the student's ability to understand the meaning of single words. The student was given a word and asked to point to a picture that best goes with the word. The average range for the standard score on this test is 85 to 115, which puts the student solidly within the average range with a standard score of 107. The following table outlines the student's receptive vocabulary scores. So here they have a raw score of 132, the actual number that they had right. That's turned into a standard score of 107, which is right in the middle of that 90% confidence interval and yields a percentile rank of 68th, or the 68th percentile.